Over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. You probably knew that. What they don't put on the memorial wall is how many of them went down from a sharp stick coated in human feces, shoved into a hole in the ground. That number is harder to pin down. But we have one data point that should make your stomach turn. A US Army surgical report from 1967 concluded that for every 3 weeks of combat, 324 soldiers ended up in the hospital with punji stick wounds. Wounds not from bullets or shrapnel, infected bamboo stick injuries. I know, you came here expecting something with a serial number and a spec sheet. Instead, you got a stick and some poop. But stay with me, because I've been doing this long enough to say that this particular weapon might be the most brutal thing ever invented. The Vietnam War officially kicked off for the US in 1965, though fighting in the region had been going on since the late 40s. By the time American ground troops were rotating through in any serious numbers, the Viet Cong had been fighting colonial and occupying forces for decades. They knew the terrain, the jungle, and they'd had a long time to figure out what to do when the other side has F-4 Phantoms and you have a rice paddy. The answer they kept coming back to was asymmetric harassment. Don't fight the Americans on American terms. You won't win. Make every step a gamble instead. Booby traps, across all their varieties, accounted for roughly 11% of American deaths and 15% of wounds throughout the entire war. 15% of wounds. Think about that for a second. The US military brought napalm, Agent Orange, B-52 carpet bombing, helicopter gunships, and more artillery than was fired in all of World War II. And 15% of their guys still got hurt by things someone built with wood, wire, and whatever was on the jungle floor. Punji sticks were the most common of those traps. They accounted for about 2% of all wounds to American soldiers. 2% sounds small, until you do the multiplication. There were over 300,000 Americans wounded in Vietnam total. 2% of 300,000 is 6,000 people. 6,000 soldiers stabbed by sticks in holes in the ground. And that doesn't count the ones who got hurt but didn't report it, didn't need hospitalization, or got infected and died from something that got logged as a disease casualty. The real number is almost certainly higher. So, what actually was a punji stick? The word punji has a genuinely old history. The Oxford English Dictionary traces spellings like panji and punj back centuries. It likely originates from Tibeto-Burman languages used in Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Bamboo spike traps have been a feature of warfare in this part of the world for a very long time. The Vietnamese used them against Mongol invasions in the 13th century, and underwater to cripple the hulls of invading ships. General Tran Hung Dao, who drove the Mongols out of Vietnam in the 1280s, wrote military strategy manuals documenting these techniques. And the Viet Cong literally studied those texts in the 20th century. This is a weapon with a bibliography. The basic construction is almost insultingly simple. You take a length of bamboo, shave one end to a point, and harden that point over fire so it doesn't split on impact. A sharpened, fire-hardened stick, the kind of thing you could build in an afternoon with tools from any rural household. Then you dig a hole. This is where the real skill comes in, actually. The pits were dug along commonly used paths, in fields designated as helicopter landing zones, at river crossings, in the spaces between tree lines where soldiers had to cross open ground. The Viet Cong marked their own traps using broken branches, certain configurations of sticks on the ground, palm leaf placements, things their own people recognized and Americans didn't. You could walk right past a marker and have no idea it was there. The pit got covered with a frame of thin bamboo or woven grass, then camouflaged with dirt and leaves until it looked like solid ground. When a soldier stepped on it, the cover gave way. Depending on the design, either their foot went through onto the upward-facing spikes at the bottom, or their whole body fell in. The version where your foot goes through is bad. The version where you fall in is worse, because some pits had additional stakes angled downward along the walls. You go in feet first, get impaled at the bottom, and when you try to pull yourself out, the angled wall spikes dig in from the sides. You can't get out without doing more damage to yourself. Your squad has to stop the entire operation to dig you free. And there was a trap within a trap variation that I find impressive in the most awful way possible. Next to the original pit, the VC sometimes dug a second, shallower covered hole. When a soldier's buddy ran over to help, he fell into the second one. One trap, 2 casualties, and now the whole squad is standing in a minefield they can't see, deciding whether to keep moving or wait for medics. Let's talk about the feces. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge that yes, this is gross, and yes, I am going to explain it anyway. That's what we do here. The punji stick's primary purpose was never to kill. This is what most people get wrong about it. Killing an enemy soldier removes one problem. Wounding him badly enough that he can't walk creates 3. Someone has to carry him, someone has to stay with him, and a medevac has to come in. The whole unit slows down, breaks formation, exposes itself, waits. You take one guy off the board and you've degraded the entire unit's effectiveness for hours. But a shallow leg wound from a sharpened stick heals. A few days, maybe a week, and the guy's back in rotation. That's not good enough. You want him out for weeks, ideally months. Enter the feces. Human and animal waste was smeared directly onto the tip of the stake before the trap was set. The logic is medically straightforward. A contaminated puncture wound in the foot or lower leg, in a jungle environment with limited sanitation, extreme humidity, open water everywhere, and no easy access to surgical care, is a wound that will almost certainly get infected, and not a tidy, localized infection, the kind that spreads. That 1967 Army report didn't just say some soldiers got infections, it said every single one of them required infection treatment. The common bacteria involved include Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus, and Clostridium perfringens, the primary agent in gas gangrene. Gas gangrene is worth understanding if you don't already, because it's significantly worse than its name suggests. The bacteria produce gas as a metabolic byproduct as they consume tissue. The affected area swells, turns discolored, smells of decay, and can progress from a foot wound to a systemic, life-threatening crisis in less than a day, if not treated aggressively. Treatment historically meant amputation. Get there fast enough and you save the limb. Wait too long and you're saving the man's life by removing it. The VC also sometimes mixed in plant toxins, animal venom, or whatever rotting organic material was available. The goal wasn't a specific bacteriological cocktail. It was, make this wound as infected as possible. Some soldiers reported the sticks being left in place in the wound, contaminating deeper tissue layers. Others described the stakes set at angles, so the tip broke off inside the foot on impact. The US military's response in the early years was inadequate. Boots were not designed for this kind of injury. The standard jungle boot used by American infantry in the early part of the war had a canvas upper and a rubber sole, neither of which offered meaningful protection against a spike designed to punch straight through. In 1966, the military began issuing a new jungle boot with a stainless steel insole. The idea was that the steel plate would stop the spike before it reached the foot. It did, often, but it also made the boot noticeably heavier, and soldiers in units that spent all day walking through rivers and rice paddies had complicated feelings about carrying more weight on their feet. In 1965, booby traps were responsible for 70% of casualties in some combat areas. The psychological weight of this doesn't show up cleanly in casualty statistics. Every soldier in the field knew, at every moment, that the ground might not be solid. Every step in dense vegetation, every shallow river crossing, every paddy dike was a question mark. You couldn't see them, couldn't reliably detect them without slowing to a crawl. The VC deliberately placed them in areas that were hard to avoid, on the only path through a village, in the only clearing big enough for a helicopter to land, in the river you had to ford because there was no bridge. You couldn't stop going to those places, so you had to accept a certain baseline level of ambient dread and keep moving. That's not a trivial thing to live with for a year-long deployment. There were other trap configurations worth mentioning. The bamboo whip was a pole pulled back under tension, covered with foot-long spikes attached to a tripwire. When triggered, the pole snapped forward fast enough to impale whoever tripped it. Reports put the speed at around 100 miles per hour. The swinging mace was a ball of hardened mud or metal up to 2 feet across, with spikes embedded in it, hung from a tree and released by tripwire. A 40-pound spike ball swinging into your torso from above is not something you survive cleanly. The tiger trap was a board covered in downward spikes weighted with bricks that fell from above when a tripwire was tripped. The Venus flytrap variant was a box sunk into a rice paddy, submerged so you couldn't see it, with inward angling barbs that would let your foot in and make it agonizing to pull out. The cartridge trap, sometimes called a toe popper, buried a single round of ammunition on an improvised firing pin. Your own weight stepping on it would drive the pin into the primer and fire a bullet upward through your foot. And then there were the tunnels. The Cu Chi tunnel system, northwest of Saigon, eventually stretched roughly 250 kilometers, had multiple levels, housed field hospitals and weapons caches and command structures, and the Viet Cong booby-trapped essentially every entrance. The American soldiers sent down to clear them, called tunnel rats, were typically small men chosen specifically because they could fit in tunnels most people couldn't. They went in with a pistol and a flashlight, sometimes a knife. The Viet Cong left snakes in some tunnel sections, what soldiers called 3-step Charlies, referring to how far you'd supposedly get after a bite before collapsing. Whether the 3-step thing was accurate is debatable. Whether finding a crate in a dark tunnel with a 1-foot ceiling is terrible is not. The punji sticks were eventually banned by international law. Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, signed in April 1981, prohibits their use. They're listed alongside landmines and other indiscriminate devices. The Vietnam War was, in large part, the reason that protocol got written, which is a strange kind of legacy for a sharpened stick and some feces. What I keep coming back to is the resource asymmetry. The United States spent, in direct military costs alone, somewhere around $840 billion on the Vietnam War in today's money. They deployed jet aircraft, carrier groups, chemical weapons, surveillance systems, an early version of the electronic battlefield concept that was supposed to use sensors to detect enemy movement. They had thermal imaging, seismic sensors, acoustic sensors, things the other side couldn't even imagine having. And none of it fully neutralized a trap that cost nothing to make, required no supply chain, could be built in an hour by anyone who knew what they were doing, and was refreshed just by being near any living organism. The Viet Cong had to pay a logistical cost for every bullet they fired. They didn't pay one for every punji stick they set. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants on Earth. A field cleared of it in the morning can have shoots back by evening. The raw material for this weapon is essentially inexhaustible in Southeast Asia. You can't interdict the supply chain because there is no supply chain. I think about how many hours of American military planning went into the booby trap problem and how the fundamental answer they came up with was, be more careful and change the boot. There was no technological fix to a stick in a hole. You can't bomb a sharpened stick program. There's no factory to destroy. That's what the punji stick teaches you about warfare, that the expensive stuff doesn't. It's a contest of will and resourcefulness and patience. The side with the F4s and the napalm lost. The side with the bamboo and the feces did not. The punji stick is now in the Geneva Convention. That probably would have confused someone in the 13th century, being told that a future civilization would need a formal international treaty to stop people from putting sharp sticks in holes. But then again, the 13th century version would probably just be confused by the treaty part. Sharp sticks in holes seem pretty obvious to anyone who's ever fought a stronger opponent on home ground. The number on the wall in Washington is 58,281. 11% of those deaths came from traps and mines. Some portion of the 15% of men who came home wounded, who never made it onto that particular list, were walking around for the rest of their lives with nerve damage in their feet, recurring infections, amputations, the specific mental weight of having been taken out of a war by something that cost less than nothing to build, just a stick, and time, and whoever has the patience to wait for the other side to step somewhere they shouldn't.